Greetings. My name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp by J. Brent Morris. Imagine a vast, deep, dense, forbidding swamp of tea-colored water and mud and patches of dry ground, blisteringly hot, thick with populations of alligators and panthers and poisonous snakes and legions of biting insects and all manner of various other perils. Now imagine you are an enslaved person, compelled to long hours of punishing labor, routinely beaten, likely scarred, maybe branded, perhaps raped, subject to helplessly watch your loved ones sold away from you forever, with no hope for any future except more of the same. Then imagine that swamp as your salvation. You don't have to imagine any of it, because at one time it was all very real. It was the Great Dismal Swamp, a geography shared by Virginia and North Carolina that was in the antebellum about 2,000 square miles, roughly the size of Delaware, which indeed proved the salvation for thousands upon thousands of the enslaved across many generations, because it represented freedom, a certain haven out of reach of white slave catchers armed with rifles and vicious bloodhounds who were in terror of entering the swamp and ever again emerging alive. Rather than an underground railroad to distant places where slavery did not exist, this was instead a kind of tunnel into a fantastical alien territory where slavery could not exist. The enslaved men, women, and children who chose this course or were driven to it were called Maroons, and if they survived, they would be forever free. All but forgotten, echoes of their 17th, 18th, and 19th century stories, long lost to history, are gradually being recovered with 21st century methods through archaeological excavations, scientific analysis, and historical scholarship. Much remains unknown, yet unexplored, but a fascinating chronicle of what we've learned or can at least surmise can be found between the covers of Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp, by J. Brent Morris, an extremely well-written study of a place and its peoples most Americans probably never knew existed. I had a peripheral awareness of marronage, the self-emancipation of the enslaved who fled to live in the wilds, elsewhere in the hemisphere, but no idea that the process was so prevalent in the American South, nor that the numbers were so large. Exact figures are impossible to ascertain, but it seems that many thousands of fugitives and their descendants lived in the Great Dismal Swamp. Some estimates run as high as 50,000. That kind of scale demands far more attention than traditional studies have granted, which is what makes this fine work by Morris so valuable to students of the antebellum. But I might never have come to it at all had I had not first attended a presentation by David Silkenet entitled Slavery and the Environment in the American South, at the Civil War Institute 2023 Summer Conference at Gettysburg College, a lecture I nearly skipped because I thought it might be dull. I could not have been more wrong. Silkenet's skills at the podium are equal to his talents as a historian, and I sat captivated by his exploration of how much better adapted the enslaved were to their respective environments than their brutal white masters could have conceived. This empowered them to supplement their often meager rations by hunting and foraging after hours, as well as flee to marronage if there were wild lands nearby. But the true epiphany for me was when he put focus on the intricate mechanisms of the societies that developed and endured in the wildest and most massive space to host maroon colonies in the South, the Great Dismal Swamp. When his talk concluded, I picked up a copy of his book, Scars on the Land, An Environmental History of Slavery in the American South, and started in on it right away. Marronage only represents a small slice of Scars on the Land, but there's a story in it that affected me deeply. Silkenet cites the memoir of the formerly enslaved Charles Ball, which relates the tragic tale of his encounter with a naked and filthy runaway named Paul, who had fled a beating to a nearby swamp. Paul's escape was handicapped by a heavy iron collar around his neck that was fastened with bells to help discourage escape, which Ball attempted to remove without success. When Ball returned a week later to try to assist him further, he found only the decaying corpse of Paul, who had hanged himself from a tree limb, crows pecking at his eyes. For Paul, clearly, not only was swamp life preferable to enslavement, but so too was suicide. This episode serves as another stark reminder that slavery in the South, long misremembered as a benign or even benevolent institution, was for many thus subjected marked instead by a horrific lifeway of oppressive labor, routinely punctuated by cruelty so severe that a dark and dangerous swamp was a welcome refuge. And for some, like Paul, if that course failed, death yet remained a better alternative than living in chains. In Dismal Freedom, Morris, assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, succeeds brilliantly in recreating for the reader both the environment of the Great Dismal Swamp in the antebellum and the desperation that drove the enslaved to inhabit it, at any and all costs, as well as offering educated imaginings of the complex, vibrant communities that once thrived at its edges and in its depths. To this effort, he brings to a series of tight, well-crafted chapters a multidisciplinary toolkit that relies on the historical record, oral tradition, archaeological evidence, ecological studies, and much more to collectively summarize what is known of maronage in the Dismal over several centuries before it went extinct in the years that followed the Civil War and Emancipation. Still, it's not all data. Morris has a keen eye for interpretive analysis that resurrects for a modern audience the nuances of long-dead populations. But as a careful historian, he never fails to distinguish fact from speculation. And along the way, material that might otherwise be tedious is enlivened by the author's talented pen and his obvious passion for the subject. There's a lot of history here, plenty of it unfamiliar. How many know of George Washington's founding role in the Dismal Swamp Company? A fantasy turned to failure that dreamed of draining the swamp for agricultural purposes. Or that this attempt ultimately enlarged the Maroon population, as some of the enslaved put to grueling labor in this effort fled to the dark recesses of the swamp. And who knew that Nat Turner's father Abraham was rumored to be a Maroon denizen of the Dismal, a footnote to that famous rebellion that was to weigh heavily long afterwards upon terrified whites who saw portents of insurrection in every corridor. Morris also puts maronage in context as a phenomenon by no means limited to this geography. Wherever slavery existed, adjacent to wild places, those bold enough to dare would attempt to seek haven there. And not only enslaved blacks became Maroons, Native Americans and even whites who lived outside the law would also call the Dismal Swamp home. For all, swamp life was both challenging and dangerous, but it offered freedom not only in the literal sense, especially for the enslaved, but a genuine independence from authority of all kinds as well. For many thousands, the payoff was well worth the risk. Morris identifies three different types of Maroons who peopled Dismal. The first were the deep swamp Maroons, who secretly dwelled far into the interior, fully secluded from the outside world. Some constructed cabins on stilts amongst the reeds, but many more put down stakes in the hundreds of the Dismal's habitable islands, large and small, of drier ground, called Messick Islands, that hosted individuals, families, and larger settlements. It is believed that trade networks were established between villages, and, ever wary of outsiders, that generations of Maroons thrived there in isolation. And it turns out that the at first forbidding tea-colored water of the Dismal is actually pure and safe to drink. Stained an amber color by tannic acids from decomposing bark, the tannins inhibit the growth of bacteria and act as a preservative. So Maroons could always count on a reliable source of potable water in what was an otherwise hostile milieu. Then there were the fringe Maroons, who existed at the edges of the swamp. Because of their proximity to plantations, their liberty was more precarious, but that was offset by their ability to clandestinely trade goods and resources with those who remained enslaved, especially family members. Some even produced products like shingles, which were valuable beyond the boundaries of the swamp. There were also runaways who sought temporary refuge at the swamp's margins as fringe Maroons, who then, unlike the hapless Paul, might, after a time out, return to surrender to slavery and take their punishment. Some resorted to this practice more than once. Later, notably after the completion of another of Washington's early visions, the Dismal Swamp Canal, which ran 22 miles to connect the landlocked sounds of Virginia and North Carolina, corporate ventures brought lumber and shingle industries to the region, and a third type of Maroon emerged. Known as liminal Maroons, these wily sorts would habitually step in and out of maronage, maintaining their freedom but making a living off the white man's world. Like their fringe Maroon brethren, once familiar with the Dismal's ecosystem and how to survive there, formerly enslaved blacks could easily slip in and out at will, while their white captors could only proceed so far in pursuit, retreating in terror at dangers real and imagined that might lurk within the dark interior. This is not to say such attempts were ever abandoned, only that these went largely unsuccessful. which further incensed slave owners for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, of course, was that Maroons represented thousands of dollars in human property drained from their pockets, lost and unrecoverable. Second, viable Maroon communities served as an open invitation to other potential escapees. But there was something else that infuriated them far more than any financial injury incurred. That numbers of the formerly enslaved could endure free and out of their clutches was an abomination they could not abide, yet they frequently found themselves powerless to redress. Their rage was fueled further by the paranoia of slave insurrection that dominated the Southern plantation mentality. The slender thread that may have connected Nat Turner to the Dismal via his runaway father was imagined by many as a kind of sturdy chain linking their ostensibly docile chattel slaves with a restive savage mass hiding in the swamp, ever ready to rise up in concert and murder their white masters in their sleep. It never happened, of course, but it did not stop them from believing that the threat was real. In between the books by Silkenet and Morris, I read The Battle of Negro Fort, The Rise and Fall of a Fugitive Slave Community by Matthew Clavin, a stirring account of a Maroon colony that existed in a setting that was almost exactly the opposite of the hidden sanctuaries of the deep swamp Maroons of the Dismal. This was what became known as the Negro Fort, a refuge for fugitive slaves recruited into service by the British in what was then the Spanish colony at East Florida during the War of 1812, who opted to remain behind after hostilities concluded in a military fortification heavily stocked with cannon and munitions that even had the audacity to continue to fly the Union Jack after the Brits decamped. This outraged General Andrew Jackson, who plotted to ultimately annihilate the fort, an act quietly countenanced by the American government. At the end of the day, the very existence of Maroon communities represented a kind of thumbing of their noses at white supremacy, something that simply could not be tolerated. Fortunately, great numbers of Maroons met happier outcomes in the Great Dismal Swamp, and while turning the pages of Dismal Freedom, the reader cannot help but cheer for all those who remained out of reach of those who would return them to cruel captivity. It's also worth cheering for Morris, who has in one slender volume turned out a magnificent addition to the historiography that is also that rare work both suitable to a scholarly audience and accessible to the non-academic. As Morris well underscores here, recent studies have only barely scraped the surface of all that remains unknown about Maroon communities, in the Dismal as well as elsewhere. But if you're as intrigued by this nearly forgotten history as I am, you'll be in for a real treat when you dive into Dismal Freedom. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews on an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarpbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.